Bang bang, 104, BMW 8 Series.
Visiting is printed, visiting is good, seems that all they ever...
This, my friends, is a two-door diesel BMW, but it is unlike any of the other two-door diesel BMWs that you see knocking about. It's not an 8-year-old 320d, basically. Not like that at all, in fact, because this two-door BMW diesel sounds like this. It's a diesel, remember, okay? This engine is absolutely unbelievable because it does 46 miles per gallon, but it also sounds a bit like... And yet, when you're not in sport mode with your foot flat on the deck, it's as quiet as can be. Now, I know diesel is getting a bad rap at the moment, and justifiably so, but as feats of engineering go, that thing up there is peak tractor engine. It's a 3-litre 6-cylinder twin turbo, and it's one of only 2 engines that you can get in the 8 Series at the moment, because I know that there's an M, although a proper mental M1 is imminent, and it's so good that it actually renders the other one, the 850i, a little bit pointless, arguably. I mean, sure, on paper the 850i is absolutely astonishing. 530 horsepower, 0 to 62 in 3.7 seconds, supercar stuff really. But also it returns supercar poor MPG, and it costs almost £25,000 more. Is it really that much better? Probably not. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but this really is one of the world's great engines. And aside from that, it's entirely suited to the character of this car. See, proportionally, the 8 Series does have a hint of the supercar. As in, it's super wide and it's really low, and it's got a comically long bonnet and a big swoopy arse, and the boot is almost useless. As are the rear seats. And you sit so low that you basically have to guess where the grille is. But really, BMW already has a proper supercar, sort of, in the i8. So what this really is a fancy grand tourer type of thing. It's the sort of thing that the Bentley Continental GT does, although not to compare these two cars directly, because clearly there's a vast price difference. The sort of thing that drives like a proper sports car on the one hand, but also behaves like a true luxury car on the other. Two seemingly mutually exclusive hands. I have to say though that this lengthy fella gets it absolutely spot on. What's immediately apparent about the 8 Series is that it's clearly been set up for day-to-day comfort. Now, the ride quality isn't perfect, it's still easily unsettled by a big pothole or a dead badger or something, but generally it has that smooth riding quality that you would expect more from a luxury limo. Steering's the same, it's all at once, pin sharp but really light. And again, the engine is generally quieter than the church drummer.
And my faith will be made strong.
And finally, this being a top-end BMW, most of the noise of the outside world has been engineered right out. It really is the sort of car that you can sit in for hundreds of miles, no bother. Although I have to say that this particular driver's seat doesn't really suit me very much. It gives a bit of backache. But that happens sometimes. True story, the most uncomfortable driver's seat I have ever sat in was in a Rolls-Royce Phantom. Who would have thought it?
Pardon me, do you have any Grey Poupon?
Back to what's good about it, despite what I said before, the 8 Series here isn't actually that bad in the practicality stakes, and particularly for a car that looks like this. There's plenty of oddman space, my 2 kids fit in the back, no bother, and actually it's surprisingly airy in here. And by volume, the boot is pretty good really. The main problem is actually how thin the aperture is. But then, when you buy a car like this, you know that you're not buying a people carrier, right? You do expect it to drive like a proper sports car though. And what do you know?
And you
Does. Now, quite surprisingly, both this and the 850 are X-Drive only, which is to say that they're 4-wheel drive, which is also to say that you can't get this, a top-level BMW sports car, with just rear-wheel drive. Which is weird in and of itself, but especially so when you think about this car's predecessor, the original 8 Series. Now, that thing was a proper sports car. V12 engine at the front, rear-wheel drive, manual gearbox. Which is another thing you can't get, a manual shifter. Although that's not that surprising because, you know, it's 2019. But yeah, 4-wheel drive, automatic only. Now that's the sort of thing that sends BMW forums into hyperdrive, but it only actually takes a couple of corners for you to realise that there is nothing to worry about, because this gives you exactly the sort of poised driving lols that you expect from a top-end BMW. Now personally, I find modern BMW steering racks a little bit too light, and this is no exception. But you can always feel what's going on underneath you, the turn-in is pretty much instant, and in general the balance does feel rear-wheel drive. Now that's mainly because the 4-wheel drive system's really clever, and it's using a clutch that sends most of the power to the rear wheels most of the time. It only shunts torque to the front when it feels like you need it because you're losing grip or whatever. In other words, most of the time you are driving a proper BMW that's being pushed from the back, and yet you get the sort of safety net that is useful in a car that's this powerful and this responsive. It also has a proper automatic gearbox rather than a trendy twin clutch thing. Now what that gives you is super smooth gear changes when you're just driving normally, and that's another thing that helps this feel like a luxury car. But actually when you're giving it some, it snaps through the gears so quickly that you might be fooled into thinking it's a twin clutcher anyway. The result is a car that is just endless fun from one corner to the next, but without being that scary. So pretty much a sensational amalgamation of two seemingly opposing qualities. Very exciting sports car and yet supremely refined runabout. What's not to like? A few things actually. Firstly, for me, BMW cabin design has just fallen well behind the other German stuff, especially the top-end stuff. It's not as sumptuous and luxurious as the Mercedes stuff, nor as overtly techy as what Audi's doing. Instead, you get a cabin that's well built, of course, but also that's pretty button-heavy and quite uninspiring to look at. And most egregiously, in a car this expensive, almost identical to the cabin in the latest 1 Series. I mean, it passes the soft touch tests, like even the door pockets are spongy and this stuff under the center console is too. And there's like stitched leather stuff that may or may not be real covering the top sections. But like this panel down here that has the gear shifter and the iDrive controller, it's actually got blank sections in it, which just looks naff. And the iDrive itself, right, even though it's infinitely less fiddly than it used to be, it still feels a bit old hat compared to the best touchscreen stuff that like Audi's doing and even JLR's doing these days. Partly because in a stubborn effort to stick with the iDrive controller, I assume, BMW's made the screen touch sensitive even though the software has clearly been designed with iDrive in mind. That means it just feels like a bit of a compromise sometimes. It would be much better if BMW would just drop that whole thing and actually concentrate on a really nice touchscreen. You know, you could use that gap for like a false tan lotion dispenser or something else that might be useful for the average BMW driver.
And then a wheel will laugh. High five.
Whatever, it still feels like an awful lot of car. Loads of kit as standard, which you'd expect obviously, and which you can look at in great detail if you go to the HJ website. I'll put a link below. What I will say is that it does feel like a luxury car. Head-up display, fully digital instrument panel, and an absolutely fabulous crystal style gear shifter. It's a bit cheesy really. And that's really the only reason why I would hesitate to buy one of these if I had 80 grand to spend and no need for any real practicality. Not the gear shifter specifically, obviously, but just this general sense that it's not quite special enough in the cabin. Not quite distinct enough from any other bog standard BMW on the inside. I think that would just get to me, you know? Although having said that, whenever it was getting to me, I would just hit the sport button and put my foot down. And then I would mutter something about this being a diesel, and then I'd find a few corners, and then I'd feel great again. Thanks for watching. More on this over at HJ. I'll put some links below. Please hit subscribe if you haven't done so already and watch our other stuff, and I will see you next week, no doubt for a small boring crossover. Cheers, bye. Despite everything I've just said, what is most miraculous about this car is that it manages to be this quick whilst dragging the key along. Look at the size of this thing, man. It's absolutely massive.